first question we have here, right, is how did you develop the skill to investigate, and what advice would you give to inspiring investigative journalists?
Well, first I had to become a journalist, a plain reporter covering beats like police or housing or what have you. And then eventually sort of my editors would give me more time to dig into deeper subjects. And that's kind of what investigative journalism is. You're crawling into the underbelly of powerful people, powerful institutions who don't want their stories told, but there's usually a very big public interest in telling those stories. So it's kind of a combination of being persistent, you never let no stop you, looking for documents, right, that open a window on these secret worlds, and then being really, really careful as a journalist, because accuracy really matters. You don't want to be making mistakes when you're doing investigative journalism. So those are kind of the key components.
Question, how do you find people who do not want to be found?
Well, usually you're chaining what we call, you're talking to one person, right? Who's kind of in the area you're reporting on, whether it's the military or government contracting or whatever. And always at the end of the conversation, you're going, who else should I talk to? And maybe even in the course of interviewing that person, they might go, hey, you really should talk to Bob, or Kenneth over here. They know a little bit about that. And if you don't, if you want, I can reach out to them. So it's a matter of kind of developing one good source who then leads you to other good sources. And then, as I mentioned, documents, inside documents, right, will reveal to you kind of key people who work in these secret places. And those are the ones then you want to reach out to because they know what's going on.
How long were you in Algeria?
About a week. So here's what happened, right? So 9/11, working for the New York Times investigative group, we all became national security reporters. I went to Iraq during the war to torture the Pentagon for failing to equip American soldiers with simple body armor, protective armor. And then I was kind of writing about the war on terrorism. And in Algeria, I was looking at how the American war on terrorism was actually helping insurgents there fight their own repressive government. And I got in some trouble, had to come home immediately to the United States. And I only mention that really because it was like going from one war to another, because my editor at the Times had spotted this outbreak of salmonella in peanuts being manufactured down on the border of Georgia and Alabama. And she goes, Michael, maybe we should take a look at this, right? I mean, who's using these peanuts? And it turns out these peanuts that were tainted, making people sick all over the country, were being used as ingredients by these huge processed food companies. And that's the war. While we were out, in the rest of the world reporting on another kind of war, many more people arguably were in this country getting sick because of the hidden cost of convenience foods, fast foods, processed foods in the grocery store. And that's how I got into writing about food.
I was going to say, that seems like your introduction into
Yeah, it was a complete sort of chance. And in fact, I thought, they called me back from Algeria because it got dangerous and I had to come back and do something safer to do. That didn't quite happen. It wasn't as dangerous as being in Algeria necessarily, but I felt it was even a much bigger, more important story to be working on as an investigative reporter, and I've been doing so ever since.
Why did the situation in Algeria get so dangerous for you?
So here's what happened. So we were following and interviewing insurgents there when a couple of FBI agents showed up at the New York Times headquarters in New York looking for me. They told my editors I had landed on an Al-Qaeda hit list because of all the reporting I was doing in Morocco and Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, reporting on the war on terrorism. I don't know if it was that or just the Algerian government trying to get rid of me, but it was enough to scare my editors and me into calling me instantly back to the United States to look for something else to do.
I know in other countries journalists are disposed of for finding information, but do you have to get security at a certain point in America when you release a certain story?
Not in America. I mean, overseas you have security. When I traveled through the Middle East, I would have a driver, bodyguard. Sometimes I'd have to embed with the military just to get from point A to B. Fixers who could sort of help you. You don't really have that. I mean, surprisingly, well, for me anyway, in these food companies, it's not a matter of sort of personal safety. I mean, they might come at you from a professional standpoint, right, to try to undermine your reporting in some way. But I have to say, with the food industry, I've been surprised at how non-aggressive they've been with me in terms of my reporting. But when you really kind of look at it, I mean, the stories I write and the books I write are based on their internal documents and their own people becoming whistleblowers, right? And sort of, ratting them out and revealing all their secrets. So there's really not much they can push back on.
All right. I want to talk about your masterpiece, right? Salt, sugar, and fat. Initially, you mentioned a little bit where the idea came from, but where did the whole idea came from for you to really get into investigating the food industry?
Yeah, so the first, sort of my first foray into this $1 trillion industry was over accidental contamination, right? Salmonella, E. coli in meat, right? Which kind of opened the door. But then I was meeting with one of my best sources, a guy who tests meat for the meat industry for E. coli. And he said, Michael, as tragic as these incidents of contamination where people are getting sick eating this food, you really should look at what my industry is intentionally adding to their products over which they have absolute control. He was worried about all the salt going into processed meat. And when I started looking at salt, I then realized that oil and sugar and salt was this unholy trinity, if you will, in which this industry relies on to get us to not just like their products, but to want more and more of them. And so that's when I was off and running, looking at the processed food industry and all of the incredible things it does to get us hooked on its products.
What was the most shocking thing you learned about the food industry while doing research?
Yeah, there were kind of two shocking things. On a personal level, that the executives at these companies don't eat their own product, their own food, if you want to call it food, right? They either because they know better and they themselves can't sit down with a bag of Oreos and not eat the whole thing in like half, in a sitting, or because they don't have to, because they have enough money, they can have a personal chef and a nutritionist, and their spouse doesn't have to work outside the home, they can cook meals, right? That I think is a really important thing, is that these things that dominate the grocery store are being made by people who don't touch them themselves. On a broader level, what really kind of surprised me is how hooked they are on using gobs of salt, sugar, fat to sort of make their products, right? I had no idea. So, and that's a really interesting and important point to kind of make, which is in our hands, in the hands of a good home cook, there's nothing wrong with salt, sugar, fat. But this industry is using those three ingredients in all these ways that don't even have to do with flavor. It has to do with the logistics and the industrial setup of food. I'll tell you a story if you want, right? So at one point, salt became public enemy number one in kind of the food nutrition world, right? Because of its association with high blood pressure, heart disease. So I went to these companies and I said, why, looking at the numbers, 75% of the salt we're getting in our diet is coming from you guys, not from the salt shaker on the kitchen table. Why don't you just cut back on the salt you're using? Help us all out. And they go, and one of the biggest companies, Kellogg's.
The Kellogg's experience.
Yeah. Kellogg's, Battle Creek, Michigan, right? Makes all the cereals and other stuff. They go, hey, that's a great question, Michael. Come on in. And we're not just going to talk to you about salt. We're going to eat some salt, or not salt, as it turns out. So they made for me special versions of their biggest sellers in the grocery store, but special because they didn't have any salt at all in them. And I have to tell you, it was one of the most god-awful tasting experiences I ever had, right? So we started with the Cheez-Its. Normally I could eat those day in and day out, but the ones without salt, couldn't swallow them. They stuck to the roof of my mouth, right? Because salt adds texture and solubility. We moved on to the frozen waffles, put them in the toaster. They came out looking and tasting like straw, because salt to the industry adds color and then flavor to something that doesn't have any flavor on its own. But the The real killer were the cornflakes. I didn't even know cornflakes had salt in them, but oh boy, do they, right? So these cornflakes, without any salt at all, put them in the bowl, poured some milk over them, took a spoonful, and the chief spokeswoman for the company sitting there, and she gets this look of horror on her face. She swallows and she blurts out, "I taste metal, metal." And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I do too. I thought one of my fillings came out and was like sloshing around in my mouth. And the chief technical officer is also sitting with us. He's in charge of all things scientific. And he starts chuckling. He goes, yeah, not everybody will taste that metallic taste, but one of the beautiful things about salt for us is that it will cover up some of the bad notes, they call it, meaning bad taste, that are inherent to processed foods. And because they dump so many like minerals into cereal to make it appear to be healthy for you, it has that metallic taste. And the solution to metallic taste, right, is to put more salt into it. But the real challenge they have in the processed food industry is meat. Because when meat gets rewarmed, like in a can of vegetable beef soup, the fat in the meat oxidizes and it gives off what these chemist flavorists in the industry describe as the taste of wet dog hair. Believe it or not, that's actually a term that they use. And can you guess what the solution is to wet dog hair taste in a can of vegetable beef soup? More salt, right? So that's when a light bulb went off in my head. And one of the most surprising things in the research was these guys are more hooked on using harmful amounts of salt, sugar, fat in their products than we are, which is a real important question if you start asking, can these companies like now play a meaningful role going forward and helping us kind of change the way we eat and eat better? And that's a real open question.
I want to jump back to what you said in regards to the CEOs or upper management not using their products. It seems similar to the tech company right now, because I recently saw a documentary and they were saying how they themselves don't use these applications and they try their best to keep their children off of it.
Yep.
Right? So
yeah.
It's just a vibe where it's like illegal drugs, bro.
You're
not supposed to use your own.
You might be referring to Social Dilemma.
Social Dilemma on Netflix.
Tristan Harris, I have to tell you a funny story. When Salt, Sugar, Fat came out, Tristan visited me at the New York Times where I was back at work, and he brought a copy of the book. And he opened it up, we're having a conversation. He has he's this tech whiz kid who, invented a lot of the bad stuff in the industry. Now he's working to help people get themselves unhooked on things like smartphones and stuff. But he has every third paragraph underlined in a different highlight color. And I go, Tristan, you're really into food, huh? And he goes, no, not at all, Michael. But your companies that you're writing about in salt, sugar, fat are doing exactly what my companies in the big tech world are doing, to use psychology, to use engineering to get us hooked on their products. And I think that I can learn some things looking at the deviousness by big food that can help me sort of combat what's going on in the big tech world. So there's a lot of parallels between those two worlds, yeah.
All right, and one more I want to ask. How did writing this book impact your eating habits?
I've always been something of a little bit of an athlete. I run for exercise. And, my wife, I had two boys that we were raising at the time. And frankly, we talked about the bliss point, right? This term that the industry uses to talk about the perfect amount of sugar in their products. My two boys were like little walking bliss points for sugar. How difficult is it to raise kids in this food environment? So I think the real lesson I got from writing Salt, Sugar, Fat and then the second book was that you can't preach to people about healthy food. Nobody wants to hear that. The government's been preaching at us to eat more vegetables for decades now, and it hasn't worked, right? I think the better way to go about it is kind of what you're doing, which is to have a conversation with people and, talk with them about kind of the consequences of their eating habits. Talk to them sort of how they value food And you can do that with kids. And so that's kind of what we started doing with our kids, was having this conversation, not saying don't eat junk food, but saying, look, here's what the companies are doing to get you to eat their junk food. And kids really get it, right? They really get this sort of situation where the man, right, is coming into their lives, telling them what to do. And that, of course, happens in communities, whether it's smoking or painkillers or processed food. Kids really get that they have an opportunity here to empower them if you engage with them as real people. And so that was the big lesson from my own experience.
Please explain the importance of what the food industry refers to as the mouthfeel and tricking our brains to eat more.
Yeah, so you gotta love, and I fell in love with the language that the industry uses when they're talking to each other about how to maximize the appeal of their products. We talked about the bliss point, the perfect amount of sugar, right, in products, not too little, not too much. They engineer that intentionally. And it's not just that they engineer a bliss point for sweetness and things that should be sweet. Soda, ice cream, soda. They've moved around the grocery store adding sugar to things that didn't used to be sweet before, right? So now bread has added sugar, bliss point for sweetness. Yogurt came to have as much sugar per serving as ice cream. Spaghetti sauce, oh my God, you can some of the brands had the equivalent of a couple of Oreo cookies with the sweetness in a tiny half-cup serving of spaghetti sauce. And what that did was told us to expect sweetness in everything we eat. So when you go over to the produce aisle, where all of us should be spending more time eating things like broccoli or broccoli rabe or things that maybe have a little bitter note to them, sourness, the brain is going to go, whoa, take me back to the middle of the grocery store for that sweet stuff. Sweetness. Salt, we talked about flavor burst, right? Adding salt to everything creates a buzz in the reward center of the brain. So oil is a really key component of processed food for a couple of reasons. One, it gets the food to the point where you don't even have to chew it. It melts in your mouth. And in fact, cheese puffs, right? So you put one of those in your tongue. The industry figured out that when you press it against the roof of your mouth, it melts in your mouth, right? And when that happens, that sends a signal to the brain, telling the brain that the calories have disappeared. So no problem, Michael, you might as well just keep eating the whole bag, right? Because the calories are gone. They call that the vanishing caloric density, right? So that's one thing that they're going for with, and you can do this experiment yourself. Look in the grocery store, snack foods have a formula where 50% of the calories are coming from the oil. That's when you know it's a product you should be really aware of. So the other big part about oil is it provides what they call the mouthfeel. It's that sensation of biting into a warm toasted cheese sandwich. And you can probably tell I'm more of a fat salt kind of guy than I am a sugar guy, because my brain is lighting up right now just thinking about that. But they call it the mouthfeel because it sends a signal to the reward center of your brain, exciting it and telling you to get more of that mouthfeel oil stuff.
Can you also speak about the deception of nutrition facts on labels?
Yeah, I used to think that the nutrition facts box, right? That little box on the side of packages, usually it's tiny print. If you're getting older, you gotta put your glasses on to read it. I thought that was our best friend because it would tell us what's inside the product. Because if you go back to the 1990s, these companies didn't even have to list their ingredients, much less kind of break down the formulations of them. But I've come to have second thoughts about that because that information, well, first off, many people don't look at that. But people who do look at it get really confused because it is really confusing. They're talking about grams, right? I mean, what is a gram of something, right? They're talking in these percentages, daily serving, how am I supposed to know how this package relates to kind of what I eat during the whole day? Some of the stuff in that nutrition facts box are for things we should be getting more of, like calcium and fiber. And some of it is for stuff we should be getting less of, like sugar and saturated fats, but they don't even put it that way. And then I discovered that while some nutrition advocates were pushing to have that put on packaged labels and got the law passed, the industry loved it because they knew the psychology behind that. And the psychology is that some people call us infovores. We love information for information's sake. And the industry realized that they put all these fancy numbers on there with the government stamp. That's going to trick us into thinking this food is actually good for us. Because there's all these numbers there. It must be good, right? It's there, the facts and da 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 da.
You know, I got caught up the other day because I was looking at some little plant-based cookies, right?
Yeah.
And I said, man, the sugar's not that bad. But the serving size was only 2 cookies. And I never in my life would just sit there and eat 2 cookies. I'd probably eat about 8 cookies.
And they
That'll
know
put me
that.
at 100%
Yep.
added sugar.
Yep, and the companies know that. They did their own research showing, and this is like some years ago, where they, 33% of the people that they surveyed, confessed to eating like the whole bag of something that has 5 or 6 servings. And those are just the people confessing. Probably another, third, like were embarrassed and not wanting to confess that. So not only do they do that, but they know that it's misleading for us. But that's another way that's kind of deceptive.
All right. Because we don't have the biological tools to combat against strategies of corporations investing in food, is it unfair to expect people to eat healthy in this environment?
Yeah, I think it isn't. I think it's unfair. I think it's kind of wholly unrealistic too. I think it's really I'll tell you. Not only is it unfair, but it's outrageous in this sense. One of the playbooks of the processed food industry, which is the same playbook of big oil, big tobacco, big painkiller, is to shift or rather evade responsibility by shifting the blame to us. And what the processed food industry did in order to do that, back in the 70s, 80s, they started buying up the dieting industry. Heinz, which made high fructose corn syrup ketchup and unlimited varieties of frozen French fries,
Jenny Craig, didn't they own
bought Weight Watchers.
Weight Watchers.
Yes, and the other companies followed suit, and not only that, buying like the South Beach Diet and these other dieting programs, knowing that the best of those diets, knowing that it's so hard for people to lose weight in this food environment, that the best of those those programs like Weight Watchers on average will help people lose 5% of their weight maybe, which is okay, that's a good start, but that's not going to get you out of the obesity category if that's kind of where you are. But not only that, but the companies then move through the grocery store creating these quote unquote diet versions of their products, right? To kind of trick us into thinking we can get healthy and we can get in control of our eating habits by just switching to their diet version, which really wasn't all that different from like the full calorie version, right? So yeah, so the expectation that we somehow through more willpower can change the way we value food in light of these companies owning so much of the world, the marketing, the advertising, all of these influences are memories, right? The way they get in our heads and stay in our heads is getting us when we're young. Tell you a story. That's why both Coca-Cola and Pepsi work so hard to get pouring rights in ball stadiums, in sports stadiums, right? Because they know when kids go to a game with their parents and have one of the most joyous moments of their life, and they get a soda in the hands of those kids at the time, that soda will forevermore be associated with that joyous moment. 40 years later, that kid as an adult can be having like a totally stressed out moment. They're gonna think of that soda that they had back when they were kids because it never leaves the head. The soda is in their heads as a memory. So that's what we're up against when we're trying to change our eating habits. And so I think the really key thing there, it's not just a matter of knowing all the tricks that these companies are up to, but it's a matter of developing new habits and being patient. You can't change your eating habits in 30 days, no matter what like diet scamsters might tell you, right? You've had a lifetime of these companies sort of imposing bad eating habits. It may take you months, it may take you a year. So you have to be patient. And you have to have a game plan. You got to stick with it. That's what I think is the only way that we can turn things around and regain control over our eating habits, which is so critical to do right now.
I think that's a great point because the companies are using strategies on you, but you're not using a strategy to overcome what they're doing.
Yeah, and life is crazy, right? I mean, the thing about developing a new food habit is you have to like think about it all the time. And the 1 second you think about something else, like your grandkids going nuts, or you're working the second job, or your rent going up, you take your eye off the food ball, that's where they get you. You're walking in the grocery store thinking about something else, you're loading up on that junk processed food, impulse buying. So again, that's what we're up against when we're trying to change our eating habits.
Why are marketers and psychologists unspoken culprits in the obesity and health crisis we're experiencing in America?
Yeah, first time I realized that psychology was so important, besides kind of the getting sodas in ballparks, was the invention of the Lunchables, right? You all know that. It's the school bus yellow painted like cardboard box with a little tray inside with stuff like cold pizza and cold hamburgers and cold this and that. When they invented that, in order to sell or have a bigger market for selling surplus processed ham and processed cheese that they had, the inventors of that, who I spent some time with, were kind of thinking, there's no way kids are going to like this. I mean, what kid would want like a cold pizza Lunchable party? In fact, their parents said, you guys are out of your minds. There's no way our kids are going to eat this. But the kids went crazy for it when they actually gave it to them. And the reason is it wasn't about the food, it was about something else going. In fact, the CEO of Kraft at the time said publicly once that Lunchables isn't about food as much as it's about the badge value. When a kid walks into the cafeteria with a Lunchables, he or she is like the cat's meow. I'm like dating myself with that expression, but they were like the it thing in the cafeteria, right? Because here's the cool thing. In fact, it was even like packaged as a gift from their parents, and they brought that thing out. They didn't have to eat like the school cafeteria food. And that's when the company came up with that psychologically based slogan, which went, all day you got to do what they say, but lunchtime is all yours, right? Lunchables was about empowerment, a huge psychological, emotional component of that. Other emotions, we eat for stress, right? Snickers bar came out with the slogan, don't let hunger happen to you, tapping into that sort of emotional stress and trauma with this. I think stress and trauma can actually explain a lot about kind of our worst eating habits. I interview people who ate at McDonald's regularly, and this young woman said to me at one point, Michael, I look at the faces of people eating McDonald's like me. They're alone, they're lonely, they're going to McDonald's not for the food, but kind of for like the social, the atmosphere of being with other people, and satisfying, filling this emotional hole in their psyches. And I thought that was like a brilliant insight.
That's I wanted to say, what you're saying, I just thought about American society, as my good friend would say, is very toxic, right?
Yeah.
So because I guess the food industry knows that, and because what I want to say is this, it goes back to the previous question. It would be very hard to eat healthy in this environment because the environment is an unhealthy environment psychologically.
Yeah.
And there's so many sugary, salty things there to comfort you.
Yeah.
Because I know a lot of people's like they have sex with food, bro.
Yeah. Yeah. It's comforting, it's soothing, it's exciting. Again, it's fast, right? We're living in an incredibly fast society now where we demand and have come to expect speed in everything, from the way we get our news and information and entertainment. Well, there's nothing faster than than processed food, right? The way it's manufactured for speed to get the cost down, the way it's packaged so you can get your hand in like the cereal box and get half the box in like one handful. The way that the salt, sugar, fat hits the reward center of the brain. Scientists who used to study drug addiction know that the faster a drug hits the brain, the more apt we are to act impulsively. That's why we moved from from snorting cocaine to smoking cocaine crack, right? Because it hit the brain and it was much more addictive in that sense. Well, let me tell you, there's nothing faster than the way processed food hits the brain. I'll tell you this, these scientists did this really cool experiment a while ago where they looked at how fast sugar hits the brain and you respond to it. So just for reference, cigarette smoke takes about 10 seconds to fully engage the brain. So they sat people down on a table and they go, push the button when you taste the little dab of sugar I'm going to put on your tongue. So they put the sugar in their tongue. Those people were pushing the button, tasting the sugar, in less than 1 second compared to 10 seconds for smoking. Because, and this is a really important thing to sort of think about, which is because we're hardwired to be attracted to things like sugar, right? The sugar plays a trick. It doesn't go directly to the brain, not initially. It sends a signal through the taste buds. And that electronic signal is what goes to the brain so quickly that had those people pushing that button in less than a second. And that's really important to think about because we're hardwired evolutionary to be attracted to things like salt and sugar and fat because in reasonable amounts, they're really good for us. Just like we're hardwired to be attracted to calories. Did you know that we have sensors on our tongue that tell us how many of the calories there are in what we're eating or drinking? So for most of our existence, right, eating calories was a great thing. It was a matter of life and death. Putting on body fat was a really good thing back when you were facing famine or drought or the ice age. You know you'd be burning off that body fat, right? Well, dial forward now, and it's an entirely different situation, which these companies have exploited. They came up with these products that are full of calories. They call these things densely packed with calories, snack foods especially, but they're junk calories. They don't provide you any nutritional health value at all. But because this has only happened in the last 50 years, we can't tell instinctually the difference between junk calories and healthy calories instinctually. So we'll taste a piece of junk with 400 calories and a delicious healthy meal with 400 calories. We can't really tell down deep kind of the difference. And that's a way that they're exploiting our deepest instincts in a way that our biology hasn't had time yet to catch up.
I want to speak about the disconnect between the hospital's mission to heal and the food they provide at the facilities.
Oh boy. So I've done talks at hospitals where some of the doctors, nurses are out of their minds with anger because they're bringing people in, saving their lives in the emergency room, and then helping to kill them in like the wards of the hospital where they're getting served junky processed foods. And in their view, it's such a lost opportunity because food can be like medicine. Although I have to be careful with that slogan because you're starting to see processed food companies start using that in a devious, underhanded way to trick people. But in the purest sense, you know, we should be looking at food as fuel for our bodies, for our minds, as something that can be as powerful as medicine, as something that can help us avoid taking medicine to solve things like type 2 diabetes, et cetera, right? So there are a small number of people inside the medical world who are fighting to get their own institutions to realize that this is a real lost opportunity on their part to help educate people on the incredible importance of eating a good diet when it comes to health and illness.
So I've heard you numerous times refer to salt as a miracle ingredient, right? Can you elaborate on that more?
Yeah, so that kind of goes back to this industry using salt, sugar, fat as tools, you know, to get us to like their products, but also to want more and more of them. And it reminds me to sort of make this point too, that so much of what this industry does isn't like innovate or invent. They steal from us. Salt, sugar, fat was ours, right? And they took that and corrupted it into something that's making us sick, right? And you look at the numbers are staggering. Maybe I should remind, you know, your viewers that in this country now, look, obesity is a really crude measure. I mean, you can't just look at any individual person and think they're unhealthy because they have some extra weight. But as a population, obesity, we passed 42% clinical obesity rate in this country before the pandemic. And let me tell you, when the new numbers come out, it's going to be absolutely shocking. Anyway, the hidden cost of that is getting close to 500,000 lives lost. People dying early because of the health consequences of a bad diet, over-reliant on these processed foods, right? So that's the downside. To the industry, though, these are miracle ingredients because it lets them turn stuff that tastes like cardboard and is kind of like cardboard into deliciousness that we can't resist. I mean, their eyes get bugger when they look at like that incredible, miraculous thing that happens in their factories, right? When they take like these components that you don't even recognize as food and turn them into this incredible yumminess that we can't resist. So that's why they call it a miracle ingredient.
We touched on it a little bit. I want to delve into it deeper. Please speak about the similarities between the tech industries and the food industry's use of color to get its customers hooked.
Yeah, so here's one really good example of that, and I'll do it kind of in reverse, looking at solutions. So the food industry uses bright colors because there's a little bit of science that says when we see bright colors, we respond to it in a way that's good for them, meaning we want more of that. That's like attractive to us, right? Same thing with the tech industry, bright colors in games, in smartphones. So here's a really cool experiment. In fact, this was at Google, right? They have free food for their employees, or did anyway, right? But it included some junk food and snack stuff. And they did this experiment where they took the M&Ms, which I think had been like in a glass jar, and they put them in an opaque jar where they just kind of wrote the name Oreos on the outside. No color, right? So lo and behold, not surprisingly, it caused people to eat less of those M&Ms. They were less attracted to the M&Ms, right? Well then, Tristan Harris demonstrated this for me when I met him once. He took out his smartphone and he toggled, this was back when the iPhone had a home switch. He toggled it, his iPhone turned to black and white. Instantly, the reward center of my brain that would get excited by the color just went, I was like totally less interested, and I tried it for them myself for a week. I could only handle it for a week. I'm totally addicted to my phone, right? I put it on black and white, and it's like my usage must have gone down 50% or even more, right? So color to them, like noise, like texture, like smell, is a really powerful tool that they get us to want their products and keep wanting their products. And the tech industry does the same thing.
What keeps you on the phone the most? Are you an email person? Is it an app? Like, why do you? What gravitates you to that phone?
Oh boy, yeah, it's a little bit of social media. I have a little bit of tiny presence in all the big sites, and I get sucked in lately on these. I think they call them Reels, and I think it's on Facebook. I don't know why, and I must have clicked on something at one point. And this is crazy, but I'm getting all these Reels about crazy driving, right? Like people have these dash cams in their cars and they're catching these insane things that people are doing on the highway, on the road, ending up in like crashes and stuff. And so I think they're targeting me because I looked at one of those once, and now I'm getting flooded with these. But I just find myself, there could be a whole hour can go by and I've done nothing but watch these insane, worthless, videos that are being posted on social media. That's like my trigger. That's my trigger food for bad tech.
Can you tell us about why the history of the $1 billion or $1 trillion industry, I'm not sure, flavor house industry, the public is unaware of?
Yeah. So processed food industry, looking at everything, $1 trillion. The flavor houses are these chemical labs that work for the processed food industry. They're the chemists. I mean, did you know that there are like chemists working in food industry? They're like called food chemists. Their job is to find chemicals that will mimic kind of the real flavors in real food that you're going to cook up for yourself in your house, right? I met and interviewed and spent time with people who invented that thing called pumpkin pie spice, right? That scourge that comes along in September, October every year. Now it's like in dozens of products all over the grocery store. Well, that's invented by chemists in these what they call flavor labs, using as many as 80 chemical components to mimic the flavor of like real pumpkin pie spice, which is like cinnamon and cloves and ginger or what have you. So, but the thing that really surprised me when I spent time with them is that the main job that they do for the processed food industry is in mixing their new formulas for their products is to work to reduce the cost of those products, because they know that's one of those deep instinctual things that attract us to food. They know that when we walk in the store and that box of like breakfast toaster pastries costs 15 cents less this week than it did last week, down deep in our brains, we're going to get super excited about that. Because again, in our previous existence, our forebears, less cost meant less energy expenditure, right? It's why when we were in hunter-gatherer societies, we learned that it made a lot more sense, instead of trying to run down an antelope for dinner, just pick up that poor aardvark sitting there and you're going to get as much calories and protein, but with less energy expenditure, right? So it's down deep in our brain. And that's why these flavor houses are working so hard to find chemicals that are even cheaper than the formulation that they had last week.
But who governs or who looks at the work of the flavor houses to see that these things aren't negatively impactful on human beings?
What are you saying? I mean, that's the problem here, is that these companies, are more powerful in many ways than the government regulators who are supposedly there looking over their shoulders on our behalf, right? The Department of Agriculture plays a huge role in food, farming, nutrition, but when you look at their budget, 99.999XX% of their budget, the money that they spend, is spent promoting processed food. And the rest of it is spent helping us control our dependency on processed foods through nutritional advice, right? That you sometimes see in public service ads or what have you. So yeah, the government's not there to help us. These companies have a free rein. And not only that, but they have lobbyists working for them that will convince those government people, regulators, to look the other way.
And speaking of government, can you explain how the government linked up with corporations to make cheese so famous?
So this is a bit of a long story, but back in the 80s, the government was helping dairy farmers out by buying all the surplus milk. And they couldn't buy enough surplus milk and store it, so they started making processed cheese out of their milk. And believe it or not, the government, us, taxpayers, were storing gazillions of pounds of processed cheese in caves in Missouri because it was naturally cool down there. Secretary of Agriculture came along and discovered that. He goes, "This is crazy. Why are we this cheese is like going moldy. Can't we do something else?" And that's where the government came up with this idea. Well, why should we store it? Why don't we just get people to eat more cheese? And that's when you saw the beginning of these government programs where they shipped truckloads of processed cheese to poor people in schools as part of the free school food program. That's also where you saw the government kind of hook up with pizza chains to get them to use more cheese in pizza. So now you have pizzas where there's like 2 cheeses inside the crust, 5 cheeses on top of the crust. That's all because of this linkage between the government and the processed food industry in getting us to like buy more stuff, eat more stuff without thinking or caring about the health consequence of that kind of a diet.
And the type of cheese can we? I know it's categorized as cheese, but how much cheese is actually in the cheese that they provide to that they provided for school lunches and government programs?
Well, it depends on the product. So if you look at a package, you often see a euphemism for cheese. They call it, that's the one thing the government does. They don't let them call it cheese if it's not really cheese. And so they'll put things like cheese product. I can't even think of it. There's like 10 different names that sound like cheese, but aren't really cheese. But I'll tell you a funny story. So I was writing about Kraft and this product called Cheese Whiz. Remember that? It's a spread that you, kind of lose some crackers and stuff. Well, I was interviewing one of the inventors of Cheese Whiz. He's retired down in Florida now. And he goes, well, it's really interesting, Michael, but I went out to buy some Cheese Whiz because I love it. It's, we have it here. We're simple people. It's a nice evening hors d'oeuvre we have with a martini. I bought some home once and I opened up and tasted it. And I go, this doesn't taste like the Cheese Whiz. I know this tastes like axle grease. And he even called the consumer complaint line of his former company, Kraft, complaining about it. And so I looked into it and he goes like, what did they do here? Well, what they did was they reduced the amount of real cheese in it and replaced it with some kind of oil component that actually isn't cheese in order to reduce the cost. And by the way, you can probably guess what helps with that flavor problem in the cheeseless Cheese Whiz. More salt, right? In fact, processed cheese generally has at least a little bit more salt than kind of regular cheese because it kind of needs it for at least for the industrial process making of it, if not the flavor.
And when trying to promote cheese use, right? Who got the marketers? Was it the government or was it the companies that linked up with PR companies to spread that message?
Who got the what? Sorry.
Who hired the public relations team? Was it the government or private companies to spread this message of cheese?
Yeah, probably most of the PR work, the marketing, was by the companies. In fact, they got the dairy farmers to contribute to a fund to pay for the marketing. What the government did was said, hey, okay, you do that, but we're going to oversee this whole process to make sure it's, legit and nobody gets cheated. So what you have is that the Department of Agriculture oversees and audits the marketing that the companies do themselves, and it kind of blends together. But it's industry money, and they're tapping those dairy farmers.
I want to talk about the emergence of tech food and how it's packaged as a healthy alternative when in reality it is not healthy at all.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing. So, there's lots of things that go into a decision on what to eat in the store, not just nutrition, right? You can decide not to eat meat because you care about the animals. That's kind of where I am on meat right now. Like industrial chickens, I've been inside those chicken houses. I can't eat that, caring not about the nutrition, but the animals themselves.
Before we move on, please speak about how bad it is when you go to these farms in regards to industrial chickens.
Well, I did a story for the New York Times a few years ago where I actually went to an operation run by the government with taxpayer money where they were trying to make farm animals more profitable. They were doing crazy things like having sheep give birth in the field all by themselves. And when I saw that happening, they were freezing, they were getting eaten by coyotes because they were trying to save money on sheep herders, right? Let's save money, knock out the sheep herder, let the sheep fend for themselves, and hopefully at the end of the day, there'll still be kind of more lambs born and we'll save money, right? That kind of crazy thing, looking at that. Commercial factory farms, whether it's feedlots and these big industrial places or chicken houses, and you can see, Food Inc. is a famous movie that got inside a chicken house. You can see that for yourself. It's appalling. I'll tell you, just an example of how powerful these processed food products are. You can watch a movie like that, Food Inc., and then the next day, eat a fried chicken dinner at a fast food because of the allure and the ability of these products to kind of get you exciting and get you craving something in a way that the thinking part of your brain can't catch up to.
All right, I want to jump back into tech food now, right?
Yeah.
There's I know we have the vegan movement, but This whole plant-based thing seems like a science project for a lot of stuff. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So again, I think it's really good to kind of look carefully at this and try to figure out what problem are they trying to solve, right? So when you get to some of the plant-based burgers, I think the problem they were trying to solve was let's get the meat out of these things, right? But immediately they're kind of running into other issues, and the complaint about them is that they can be just as highly processed as regular drive-in meat hamburgers, right? And maybe nutritionally, maybe all that much, not that much better for you. Lots of salt, especially, maybe lots of fats and that sort of thing too. So I think when you see these tech products, I think they're getting really good at solving one thing, especially kind of the meat alternatives that they're doing. But it's a complicated thing, and I think they haven't gotten very good yet at creating, this wonder food that's going to be better for us in all kinds of ways at the same time.
I do have to give them credit, though, for their packaging, use of color and marketing to present it as a healthy product.
Oh, well, you see, so this is one of the tricky things now, because the big food companies are doing the same thing. They know that more and more of us are caring about what we're putting in our bodies, looking for more nutritional food, and so they're all busy pretending to make healthier versions of their products, right? So, for example, fiber. Fiber is kind of considered to be, something that can kind of help you gain control over your eating habits, fill you up faster so you don't eat too much, right? So what do these companies do? They started creating fiber in the laboratory that doesn't do that at all, but they're able to dump that in their products and increase the amount of fiber in their products without even having that kind of benefit. Protein is kind of a darling among nutritionists now, because in some kind of very careful diets, it can help you feel fuller, faster, and maybe control your weight gain, right? What does the industry do? They started adding a little bit of protein in boxes of sugary cereal, and then putting the word protein in huge letters on the front of the package, as if that's actually going to help us gain control of our products or not. So there's a lot of this trickery, I call it health washing, going on in the food industry now, that's making it kind of harder for us to go through the aisles and really determine, is this a good product or this isn't a product? Which kind of goes back to the nutrition facts box. One of the bad things about that is it plays into the hands of the food industry, because they can adjust their levels of salt, sugar, fat, fiber, protein to kind of meet whatever we're concerned about at the moment. But you have to kind of ask yourself, right, is this really a real food? Okay, the nutrition facts look okay, but is this really a real food that's going to be good for me? And I don't think that answer is in the nutrition facts box. I think it's maybe in the ingredients, but I think you even have to dig deeper than that.
Are you aware what companies are using as protein?
What they're using as protein?
To add protein?
Well, a lot of it is sort of soy protein, because soybeans are so cheaply produced around the world. I think that's been their go-to for added protein is soy protein, and some version of soy that's fairly processed.
Can you please explain how corporations invested in food are double dipping by also being heavily invested in the pharmaceutical industry?
So I actually haven't seen that yet. So they're talking about food as medicine, and one of the leaders on this was Nestle, the big company that's based in Switzerland, which for some years is the biggest food company in the world. They own the Hot Pockets brand, for example. They began looking at ways to create specially targeted versions of their food for people needing special kinds of nutrition, right? And so they started making, for example, a liquid meal that you have to eat if you've had bariatric surgery to shrink your gut, your intestinal system, in order to help you eat less, right? Well, Nestle then kind of turns around. First off, after selling you Hot Pockets, which arguably is a poster child for overeating processed food, they're now turning around and selling people this liquid drink that they're having to eat because of the bariatric surgery that they've done to try to, in desperation, to try to, reduce the amount of food, the Hot Pockets, that they're eating. So that's one of the entrees, but I think we're going to be seeing more and more of this. At least simpatico, these two giant industries, big food, big pharma, working together in ways that help one another.
Can you elaborate more? What do you mean working on ways that help?
Yeah, so you got the food industry creating, this nightmare epidemic of type 2 diabetes, and then you have the drug companies rushing out new diabetes drugs, right? And so nobody is standing back, including the government, going, well, wait a minute, why don't we just stop the need for the diabetes medicine by changing our food environment so people don't develop diabetes in the first place? So that's what I mean about the simpatico, right? Food companies, we're going to make you sick. Pharma companies, we're going to fix you up by giving you a drug. It's not going to make you well exactly, but it's going to fight that sickness that the food industry created. That's a sick situation.